Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show where we talk about the translation of Bloodborne. By now we've built up quite a collection of items to go through after focusing almost exclusively on dialogues for the past few episodes, so we're going to start things off this time by taking a look at the descriptions for another set of attire. Here we go. Graverobber's Hood. Attire of grave robbers, even within the healing church, who delve primarily into the underground ruins. The origin of the healing church is Byrgenwerth, and so they know what the ruins are. They are not merely a storehouse for the treasures that comprise the hunter's strength, but a path for those seeking out the secrets of the old higher rank ones. And now that we're back to discussing item descriptions, I'm reminded of how much I always feel like there is to say about any given one. In this case, I'd like to start with the name of these articles of clothing. Literally, the Japanese characters being used to describe this set mean grave and reveal or expose, but a quick search for the Japanese definition of the phrase haka wa baku, source of the noun associated with this set, haka abaki, brings up the following definition: to dig up graves in search of treasures or corpses, or otherwise to invade graves. This is why I've literally rendered this the Graverobber set, because the Japanese is using a noun that describes someone who robs graves. Recall, though, that the official term is Tomb Prospector, and I've heard arguments to the effect that this translation doesn't inspire in the player an appropriate appreciation for the level of desecration taking place. This, I think, is an interesting point, and I would agree that a term like grave robber strikes me as inherently less dignified than Tomb Prospector. But I would also say that it's important to keep in mind how else the official term shifts the emphasis. Prospectors, of course, are people who take on great risks in the hopes of uncovering treasures of potentially immense value. This seems relevant when we consider the final section of the item's description, which reveals that the people in question are looking for the secrets of the Great Ones, and it even denigrates the search for items that bring hunters power. In other words, we can see right here in this item description that these are no ordinary grave robbers, out only to pilfer a corpse and swap it for coin, or stuff their pockets with buried treasure. They are seeking out the secrets of the gods. And in that sense, I think the application of the term prospector works. The leap from grave to tomb, of course, is even less controversial, since this is all a reference to the Chalice dungeons anyway, and they're described elsewhere in the game as the Tomb of the Gods. Really, the most interesting thing to me about the difference between Graverobber and Tomb Prospector here is how translation is often about choosing which aspect of the original text you want to emphasize. Either term could work in English, but Graverobber arguably favors the visceral sense of defilement, while Tomb Prospector could be said to emphasize the hunt for treasure, and therefore the nature of the treasure being sought. But there are other shifts between the more literal version of this item description and the official one. In the very first line, for instance, note that there seems to be a clear distinction in who is searching for treasure in the Chalice dungeons. The official translation talks about people who explore the old labyrinth on behalf of the healing church, while the version I've provided describes grave robbers even within the healing church, which seems to imply that prospectors include both members of the healing church and people outside it, possibly hunters. This issue persists into the next set of lines as well, and honestly I'm not sure how this discrepancy arose, since I can't really see how the phrase "Iryō kyōkai no naka demo," literally even within the healing church, could be taken to mean on behalf of the healing church instead. Perhaps this is another case of changing Japanese source text, or maybe someone misread nakademo as nakodomo, mistaking even within for intermediaries as well. But if my understanding here is correct, the result is a very different implication in the English compared to the Japanese. But having covered that, let's switch gears. Foretaste of Ebrietas, remnant of the divine mystery once witnessed at Byrgenwerth. An item that summons a portion of Ebrietas, the abandoned higher rank one, using spirits, molluscal beings known to be portents of higher rank ones, as mediums. This chance meeting became the beginning of the search for outer space in the underground ruins. This is connected with the subsequent choir. Okay, so even in one language, that's a lot of information to take in, and a key part of understanding this item description in the first place is getting access to a number of things we haven't looked at yet. References to Ebrietas, phantasms, and the choir will make considerably more sense as we progress further through the game. For the time being then, I'd like to focus on things that don't require other items or game experience to understand. So, with all of that having been said, let's talk about Augurs. Traditionally, augurs were priests in ancient Rome who practiced augury, which was the art of interpreting omens from the observed flight of birds. The word has also come to be used in English as a verb, meaning to foretell or presage. Its most common usage in everyday life is probably in the phrase, "that doesn't augur well," which is basically the same thing as saying, "that doesn't bode well." Much like, "I don't like the look of this trap." But since this is all information we're applying to Bloodborne, let's take a look at the Japanese term being used for Augur of Ebrietas to see how it lines up with the definitions I've just described. The word in question here is sakibure, literally foretouch, with the relevant definition from my Daijisen Japanese dictionary being to inform someone ahead of time, or to give a sense of something that will occur later. In other words, it's a sign of what is to come. With both of these pieces of information in place then, I think you can probably see how these terms do and don't line up. On the one hand, augur in its sense as a noun is essentially synonymous with prophet, and that doesn't quite fit. Its sense as a verb, though, is much closer to the Japanese. Foretelling something and being a sign of something are pretty similar. Yet the usage in this particular case, Augur of Ebrietas, clearly calls for a noun and not a verb. Other terms that might be a better fit here include words like portent, omen, or harbinger. And of these alternatives, my favorite is probably that last one. I think harbinger of Ebrietas has a nice ring to it. But I will say that there's something about this particular usage of augur that I quite like, especially in the context of Bloodborne. In fact, it's that very sense of a word that both does and doesn't fit that I think lends it a slightly off-putting air, which is just perfect for the game's overall atmosphere. Also, I should note that the process of nominalization, or using parts of speech as nouns, is a common form of normal linguistic change, so it makes sense to me why the word might have been used this way to begin with. But there's more to discuss here than this item's name and a particular term that appears once in the description. There's another term that appears once in the description I think is interesting. That term is kaiko, which is an unusual word in Japanese that is used in relation to how everything got started here. It means chance encounter, and generally refers to an unexpected or coincidental meeting. In this case, though, it's not a reference to running into someone you wouldn't have thought you'd meet, it's describing contact with the Eldritch Truth. True, the wording is vague, but it clearly seems to be related to the Great Ones. In fact, it's probably just the sort of thing that Tomb Prospectors scour the labyrinth for even now, which means this word is getting at something crucial, and here I think the official translation does about as well as possible. After all, one of the definitions for encounter is literally to meet, especially by chance, and that's exactly what's happening here. Of course, for an example of this sense of the word, one need look no further than the famous movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which gives a very similar sense for an unexpected meeting with an alien race. Now, speaking of meetings...
Oh, heavens, would you stop that? Every peep you make brings us bad luck. I have it bad enough already. Please, just leave a poor old woman be.
Now, this is an example of a case where a little bit of interpretation makes sense of what may appear to be some rather large differences in translation. So let's think through the information we have here and see what we can come up with. This woman starts by entreating us to stop. That should lead us naturally to ask, stop what? Well, she explains what she thinks is so awful. She says we're making her listen to that inauspicious voice. On the face of it, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but if we gather that the inauspicious voice we're making her hear is supposed to be our own, perhaps in the process of hailing her through the door, her asking us to stop seems reasonable. Of course, our character has no in-game speaking voice, but we know the player character is capable of speech. From the limited replies we make in conversation, it only seems reasonable that our character regularly speaks in order to interact with these NPCs. Only we, the players, don't hear what's being said. If this interpretation is true, then, the translation of every peep you make brings us bad luck strikes me as perfectly fitting. Not only is it clear that the sound the player character is making is the issue, but the inauspicious aspect of the voice is rendered far more naturally into bad luck. And after all, someone's voice can hardly be inauspicious if it doesn't bring bad luck. Also note that while peep does generally refer to vocalized sound, it's not uncommon to associate the term with other noises, so the fact that we hear our character knock but not say anything doesn't stand out quite as much. I find this to be an elegant solution to a tricky line, but it also then sets up other ways to render subsequent lines in English. When the woman says literally, "Don't do anything so horrible," we can now infer that the reason it would be horrible for us to keep talking would be because it would bring her more bad luck. So changing this to having her emphasize how bad she has it already only makes her final entreaty more convincing. When she begs for us to just leave a poor old woman be, she is reflecting several aspects of the Japanese in a single line. She's using her frailty as one of the elderly to ask us to stop doing something she thinks will bring her bad luck, and at the same time, getting us to leave her alone. Again, a little bit of reflection goes a long way here. But let's now turn our attention to that set of attire we just picked up. Church's White Hood, attire of the special healers of the church. They're higher in rank than the black preventative hunters, with their expertise in blood healing and the plague of beasts backed by experiments. Healing, for them, is not treatment, but a method of experimentation. Some knowledge can only be obtained through direct contact with the disease. So for the most part, I think this is a fairly straightforward translation, but there are a few points I think it's worth discussing here, and the ones that interest me the most are actually in the final set of lines. First, note that in the official English translation, the last sentence about gaining knowledge through direct contact with the disease is presented as part of the point of view of the healing church doctors. The Japanese itself isn't especially clear on this point. In the original, two separate sentences are used to make these statements, and only the first of those sentences, the one about healing being about research rather than treatment, is clearly identified as being from the doctor's point of view. It uses the phrase, "karera ni totte." The second sentence is merely the statement that some knowledge can only be accessed through direct contact with a disease. It doesn't start with the same phrase, and it's not clear whether that presentation of the statement is also meant to be from the point of view of the doctors. Of course, it's perfectly reasonable to interpret this as another thing that the doctors believe, but it's not the only possible interpretation. This could be the opinion of the author of the item description, something we've seen on several different occasions by now, and the Japanese leave this possibility open, while the official English does not. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, and it could even be something the translators got feedback from the developers about, but I thought it was worth pointing out as a choice because of the impact it has on the second point I'd like to discuss. That point being the continued extension of the doctors into the situation described by the second sentence. When the official translation says, "Some knowledge can only be obtained by exposing oneself to sickness," it's presenting this scenario in what I think is a much more immediate way than the more literal, "Some knowledge can only be obtained through direct contact with the disease." Now, having direct contact with an illness and exposing oneself to it are not necessarily the same things, and the latter is a more extreme step. I feel like it emphasizes the risk and the potential madness of the action a lot more, as well as inviting the player to put themselves in the situation described. Really, this seems like a great fit for the atmosphere and the themes of Bloodborne, but I think it's worth pointing out that it does involve both a decision to frame this line as being from the church doctor's perspective, and a choice to use phrasing that is perhaps more personal than the original. This brings me to a more general point I'd like to make about translation, as this is now at least the second time in this episode we're seeing an interpretation of the Japanese shape the resulting English translation. And I'm aware that there are some people who believe that localization in general should involve none of this, that what translation should be is a straightforward, literal practice with perhaps an exception here or there for puns. What I'd like to briefly say in response, though, is that interpretation is actually inevitable, and I feel like this is especially easy to see in Japanese. Think back to an earlier episode where I pointed out that literal translations of certain phrases like noisy should in fact be properly rendered into English as shut up, or some other phrase that might seem counterintuitive. This is because Japanese is a highly contextual language. Even the question of, is this noun singular or plural, is often up for debate. There's simply no way around the fact that in translation, in language in general, interpretations must be applied. The real question, in my estimation, is how justified those interpretations are, as well as how well they fit into the themes of the game, the personality of the character, or the situation at hand. I'd like to say more, but we've reached the end of another episode. Until next time then, if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for me, please let me know. Thanks for watching, everyone.